Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog. Bring speed and scale to your security organization. Datadog Cloud Security Platform delivers real-time threat detection and continuous configuration audits across applications, hosts, containers, and cloud infrastructure. Built on top of the observability platform, Datadog brings unprecedented integration between security and DevOps aligned to shared organizational goals. As a listener to the Cloudcast, you can sign up for a free 2-week trial to see for yourself how Datadog can elevate your cloud infrastructure security posture by visiting datadog.com/security-cloudcast. Sign up now and receive a free Datadog t-shirt. That's datadog.com/security-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We start to wrap up September. Unbelievable. We're wrapping up September of 2023. By the time you're listening to this, it will be October. We will be into the last quarter of the year. The year has flown by. Hope everybody's doing well. Fall is in the air. Leaves are starting to change, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. So another Sunday Perspective show. Excited to be with you today. And today we're gonna get, a lot of times we do sort of big picture things on the show. We, or at least on the Sunday Perspective, we try and put some big things into context. Today, we're going to kind of focus on a little bit of minutia. And I don't mean to downplay minutia as if it's a bad thing, but oftentimes we get questions from people. We get feedback and comments. We always appreciate that. You can always send them to show@thecloudcast.net. But we oftentimes get questions as well, questions about technology, or, do you have a recommendation for this? Or, hey, this situation is going on. We get those quite a bit. Really appreciate them. Always happy to try and help wherever we can. And this past week, we got a question from a listener, from an audience member, who asked a question that I feel like both Aaron and I have struggled with in our career, have debated about in our career more than once, not just sort of one-time thing. And I feel like it's something that I know in talking to lots of friends around the industry, lots of people that I know and trust and have worked with for years, some cases, short number of years, other cases, many years, often struggle with. And I thought it was a great question. And so we're going to kind of dive into that today as sort of the topic for the Sunday Perspective. In essence, and I'll read through what it was. I'll sort of hold back the name to protect the innocent. But in essence, the person had written in and they said, "Hey, I've been in my current job for a number of years, and in this case, they said I'm earlier in my career. I'll get into the details of it, but they basically said, I started off as more of a technical person. Eventually, after a few years of being quite good and proficient at being a technical person, I was asked to take more of a leadership type of role. And so what that ended up doing was taking them away from the day-to-day aspects of being technical, whether it means, being hands-on or designing systems or whatever it be, kind of the thing that we perceive as being technical, into more of kind of a managerial type of role, kind of a leadership role. So you're not doing as much of the day-to-day. You're not necessarily studying the in-depthness of the technologies as you were before. And they said, I'm kind of at a crossroads. They said I was pretty good at the earlier technologies. I'm now doing the managerial stuff, leadership stuff, which I'm pretty good at, but it doesn't give me the same sort of energy and passion. And so, the question was, what can I do? What should I do? Do you have any feedback? And so I thought what I would do is dive into that today, because I think it's a really good question. It's a really common question that people have, and it's not just a question that may happen once in your career. You actually, oftentimes, if you're around the industry for a while, oftentimes go through it, multiple times. So what I'm going to try and do is give some advice, give some examples, give some experience. I'm going to do that right after the break. Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? CloudZero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. CloudZero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into a question, a listener, an audience, a community question that was asked to us that we get quite often, and not only in question form, but just in Aaron and I talking to friends within the industry, and Aaron and I have sort of shared with each other this crossroads that we've gone through. And so I'm going to read the question. I'm not going to go into all of it. And again, like I said, I'm not going to necessarily give away the person's name because, I think it was great. We really appreciate them sending the question in. But at the same time, I'm going to hide a little bit of the details just so we don't get anybody in any sort of trouble for kind of sharing this, because again, I think it's a commonly asked question. So I'm going to read part of it. I'm going to obscure part of it. It basically said, hey, I'm looking for some career advice. I'm about 5 years into my current job. I'm working as a technology consultant. And I'll highlight the consultant part of that because I think there's some aspects of that that are sort of interesting. They said, I'm struggling a little bit. And they said, I've gone from being a sort of practicing, in this case, architect, so hands-on, certified in multiple technologies, multiple clouds, and been working on a number. I get a chance to work with a whole lot of different clients. So in this case, they're working from a consulting perspective, and I think part of that has some nuance to it, and we'll dive into that. But they get a chance to work with a number of different companies, a number of different scenarios, which is again interesting. They said I've been moving and, moving from sort of, truly, being hands-on into more of a leadership type of role, because they also had the skill set to be able to, navigate some of the people side of things, navigate, kind of planning activities, navigating, working with, leaders at the people where they work with, people that have sometimes unrealistic expectations, sometimes don't necessarily understand the technologies in depth. And so you're having to sometimes educate people at, what some people would consider, oh, that's sort of a, kind of high level and fluffy and so forth. But those skills are very, very important as well. And they said, I'm at a crossroads as to where I am because I feel like I'm not as technical as they were before, and obviously that makes sense. You're not as hands-on with the technology. You're not as in-depth in all the new features that are coming out or the new capabilities. But I'm doing well in the leadership roles. Like my soft skills, my people skills are very useful. And the struggle they're running into, and this is something that we see quite often on either side of the fence, whether you're on the technical side or more of the sort of people skill side, is they said, this newer role doesn't give me the same satisfaction. I don't get the same sort of passion that I had for it before. And what they're kind of wondering is, do you have any guidance on this? Because, while they may be good in the new role, it doesn't give them the same, sort of maybe passion or motivation or whatever that the previous role did. But, they're kind of wondering, can I get that technology skill set back? Have I lost it? Should I keep pushing on? And maybe, there's more to this sort of leadership people side thing that I know. And I think it's a great question. I'll highlight, I'm going to kind of break up the second part of the show into a couple of things. I'll talk a little bit about my experience having gone through this a couple of different times. I'll talk about some of the things that Aaron and I have talked about in the past, just because we've gone through a number of different changes in terms of jobs. We've also gone through some changes in terms of where our priorities were and so forth. And then I'll share some of the guidance that we have had with various people in our industry about, how they've gone through these changes. So let me go through a couple of things just for my career, just to put things in perspective. I don't like to sort of give advice when I've never really sort of been in the shoes or sort of lived the experience that the people that are asking the question have lived. So, if you ever ask us for advice, I'll be very honest with you. Aaron will be very honest with you. Like if you ever ask us for stuff that we're just like, man, I've never really done that before, you're going to probably get we've never done that before, so we're the wrong people to ask. But anyways, so I think in terms of this, so I'll give you, let me give you a sense of sort of my career and how it's evolved. My background was not purely in technology, say coming out of university. So I wasn't computer science or mathematics or engineering. My background or my sort of upbringing, my schooling was more on the business side of things. So my initial foray into the technology world was initially, surprisingly, given my personality, on the sales side. So I came into technology at the time when the internet was sort of taking off. I came from a very competitive background and played a lot of sports. And so the technology industry was interesting to me mostly because of the competitiveness of it, right? At the time, I didn't understand the impact that technology was going to have on everyday aspects of life. Quite honestly, we really hadn't reached that point where everybody had a laptop and we're walking around and we're doing stuff on the web. This was almost like right at the beginning. So again, this is like early 90s, just to date myself. So I got into the industry. I distinctly remember having a conversation with my boss about a year into it going, I'm at a crossroads myself. I don't love this sort of sales side of things, which to me felt like I was learning a lot of the technologies. The technology learning was interesting to me. I didn't have the people skills to align to, in this case, a sales role. It was an inside sales role, but anyways, it was a kind of very people centric, very outbound personality centric. And I remember going to my boss at the time and saying, I'm learning more about this technology. The technologies are interesting to me. I'm getting a chance to spend time with our engineering teams and our systems architecture teams. That stuff is really interesting to me. I don't know that I'm very good at this other more people-centric role. And I said, but quite honestly, I feel like, and this is funny to think about it now, like I was 23 or 24 years old. And I remember telling my boss, like, I feel like I'm so far behind all these smart people that I talk to. I will never, ever catch up. I will never be able to be technical enough to ever move into one of those roles. And they said, well, look, at the time, and this is a different conversation that will probably end up turning into a Sunday conversation. My manager at the time said, well, you're in this role today. I'm paying you to do sort of sales oriented stuff. I appreciate that you kind of are studying these other things on the side, but I need you to focus on this. So first piece of advice is your direct manager is not always going to give you, the advice that's in your best interest. They're almost always going to give you advice that's in their best interest, kind of spinning it for you. But in essence, I was at a crossroads. I had to figure out, do I want to stay in this more people-centric role, or do I want to try and stretch myself into this more technical-centric role, not necessarily knowing if I could do that or not? Now, that's not exactly the question that was asked to us, because the person who asked it has sort of shown that they can do both sides of it. Anyways, fast forward a couple times through the years, I've had roles that in some cases were much more technical. I went from one of those jobs into being highly, highly technical. I got a Cisco CCIE and I was doing hands-on troubleshooting and design and all sorts of stuff. I also ebbed back and forth a couple of times into roles that were business development. I was a product manager at one point. I helped work on systems engineering teams. And I think what I've found over the years, and again, I don't know if this is the best advice for people, is I ended up finding the sweet spot for me was sort of a combination of both the people skills and the technical skills, but not necessarily on the far ends of either one of those spectrums, right? So what I found was my technical skills were good enough for 75, 80, 85% of the people that I engaged with, because, in most cases, the technology could go really, really deep, but they didn't necessarily need it at the 95th percentile deep. But what they typically would struggle with is, what is this new technology, or what does this technology do for us? The more the why as opposed to the what. And what I ended up finding was, I had to sort of bounce back and forth between a few different jobs and a few different roles at different companies and so forth. But I ended up finding sort of if you think about this question in a real simple level, like if you think about this with a spectrum, let's say on one end is the people-centric spectrum, and on the other end is the very technical end of the spectrum. I found kind of a sweet spot somewhere in between there. And what that really was the realization that most people don't want to know into the 95th percentile, the 90th percentile of the technical, but they also kind of don't want the 10 or 15 or 20% of the people, because they kind of feel like, well, that's too fluffy, right? So it's too fluffy on one end of it and too in the weeds on the other end of it. And, what I found, and I think to a certain extent Aaron found, was we had a skill set or a mindset that adapted itself towards something in the middle that could go into a certain amount of depth with the technology, could also go into a certain amount of depth with people and so forth. And, like you could listen to that and say, well, gosh, that sounds sort of interesting. Maybe I am sort of a left brain and a right brained person, and maybe that sort of thing works for people. Now, I will caution this much. The trade-off in finding things in the middle of anything, is that people that you interact with oftentimes are like, well, but what are you really doing? Are you technical, right? Or are you more sort of people-oriented? Are you managing teams? Are you leading projects? Are you doing it? And so the one hard part about sort of being in the middle is people often struggle with well, what are you doing? Are you overlapping? And so are you really kind of stepping on the toes of the technical people who maybe should be, explaining things at a deeper level or really understanding the problem better? Or are you stepping on the toes of people who, should be leading teams or driving the story around something, or, messaging or whatever? And so this is where the question kind of becomes, what do you like? What are you good at? Right. So that's the first part of it. I'll tell you, is that I think you have to figure out, kind of on a spectrum, probably for any given job, but maybe for the longevity of your career, do you feel more comfortable, or do you feel like you are better at the things that are more technical? And if that's the case, there are typically sort of, career paths that can be in the more technical, that could be, some sort of systems architect, some sort of engineer. There are sort of leadership roles but more in engineering, where the thing that you're measured on is, how good is the thing you produce, right? Like the product that you produce, or the quality of the product you produce. CTO type of roles are those types of things. And then there are the roles that are more, people centric. So this is, often, business development types of roles. They could be, kind of overlay roles if you're, working in groups that work in lots of technology, but they need people that, more on the business side of things. Oftentimes these are, sometimes called technical marketing roles. This is where DevRel and those types of jobs come along. Oftentimes consulting has to sort of live sort of in that, somewhere in that spectrum. So there's a lot of different roles within the industry that are going to be on different parts of the spectrum. So the first thing I think to figure out is, where do your skills best match? And the second part, and has been highlighted by the question, where do you find your passion? And I think part of the first trick is figuring out, number one, where are you on the spectrum at any given point in your career? Because you may also find that at some points in your career, you are more motivated by the technology part of it. And at other points of your career, you're more motivated by the people side skills or the business side skills. I think the second thing is having a realistic conversation with yourself of saying, look, at this point in my career, where am I on that spectrum? But once you sort of find that point on the spectrum, how good are you, right? If you were to compare yourselves against your peers, are you a 7 out of 10? Are you a 10 out of 10? Are you better than most of your peers? Are you just sort of average compared to your peers? And then the second question to sort of ask yourself is, where do you think you could be, right? So this is where you kind of get into assessing your ability to be better eventually, right? Your ability to learn, your ability to grow, your ability to take feedback and find mentorship and so forth. So, this is where you might say to yourself, well, I'm pretty good at the technology stuff, but I don't realistically, even with the best effort, with putting in extra hours and all sorts of things, I don't know that I will ever be a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. I don't know that I'll ever be capable of being, a CTO level person or a, VP or senior VP of engineering or something, right? So you have to be a little bit realistic with yourself of where would you like to be? Where do you think you can be? And where are you compared to your peers? So that's the second piece. And then I think the third piece is, is a realization that once you sort of identify where you think you might be on the spectrum and you kind of figure out like, where are my skills going to sort of take me? Where can I be best at it? Maybe not necessarily like I get the most passion out of it, where I might be best at it. I think you also have to realize that at any given point in time or in any given job, like the company or the role that you're in might value one part of that spectrum or one part of that combination of them more than the other, right? So, I'll give you another example. When I first joined, when I first went to work at Red Hat, I was actually, it was sort of a funny story. I joined because I had written an article when I was doing analyst work about sort of the differences between Cloud Foundry technology and Kubernetes technology. And so, I at the time was sort of doing some analyst work, and I was fairly good at writing. I could understand the technology in depth, but I wasn't putting my hands on the keyboard for either one of those things. And but I was so I was doing sort of an analysis and communication role, which again would probably fall sort of in the middle of that, technical / people skills. When I went to work for Red Hat, they initially thought that's the skill you're going to do most. And what it ended up turning into was a little different thing, right? Like I had to be very, very proficient in the technology, but I had to be even more proficient at various aspects of communication around it. And so it was far less writing, more sort of strategy, communications, but still had to be very in depth with the technology. And that was the thing that they valued. I've gone to other companies and expected to do certain types of things that were similar, and those things were valued far, far less, and they expected something else out of it. So that's the other part, is you have to realize that, picking the sort of things on the spectrum and deciding are good for any given point in time for a given role or something, but they may not necessarily be the same thing if you go somewhere else, right? So if you were to go do those types, same exact thing at a bigger company, it might be valued in a certain way. If you were going to do it at a smaller company where the roles are less well-defined, it may not be as valued. You might have to sort of move yourself a little bit. Okay, so that's sort of the first part that I kind of want to highlight is, kind of analyze yourself on the spectrum of, am I trying to be more in-depth on the technology side? Am I trying to be more valuable on the people side? Do I get value? Do I get joy and happiness out of those? But also, am I going to be good at those? Because you may love doing them and you may be super happy doing them, but you may also have some other goals of like, I want a bigger title, I want to make more money. And your analysis might make you realize that, I'm only average at that. Okay, so that's the first piece, that sort of spectrum thing. I think the second piece, in terms of when we think about this from a job perspective, is to really figure out, if you're fortunate enough, if you do end up having some of these skills, or even if you're in depth in one part of the spectrum, you're going to get opportunities. If you position yourself well, if you build skills that are good, you're going to get different opportunities. And, that's one of the great things about our industry, is that it is an industry that can be highly mobile. Right? It means you could move from one company to another. It means opportunities may come along to you that are like, oh, wow, that's really cool if you're willing to take them on, right? And the challenge is you're going to face some decisions that don't feel very binary. They're going to feel like, gosh, I just can't figure this out because there seems like there's so many variables going on. And so if you're starting to evaluate, maybe do I change jobs? Do I change sort of direction in my career? Like, am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And I always tell people, and I've told Aaron this before, he's told me this before, you kind of have to look at a number of the variables, and then you have to weigh them, or you have to determine which one of these are absolutely really, really important, and which one of these are like, well, if they're good, that'll be better. If they're not great, well, I don't really care, because the trade-off versus something else is infinitely more important. And the list that I typically make is, and again, the hard part about answering these questions is they really depend on kind of the timing of your career. Things like, do you have a family? Do you have kids? All sorts of stuff. right? In the case of, folks who have, moved around in places, sometimes your citizenship or your visa status may matter and all those things. So I'm not trying to minimize any of these things. And again, your mileage may vary. But I've often found when it comes to like, oh, here's a new job opportunity, these 4, 5, 6 things oftentimes are some of the characteristics to weigh into. So the first one for me, and Aaron and I have talked about this in the show a ton, is location, right? So we live here in North Carolina, right? Home of the massive studios, as we've talked about a million times. Him and I have both distinctly said, like, we do not want to live in Silicon Valley. We don't necessarily want to live in Seattle. We didn't necessarily want to live in Boston. Nothing against those folks, nice people. Part of it was cost of living. Part of it was just sort of lifestyle. Part of it was, where you have family roots. Him and I both have family that are in the area. So all those things were always a big part of it. And we sort of said, okay, we don't want to live in Silicon Valley. We'd like to live in North Carolina. We knew that came with trade-offs, right? It meant there were probably going to be less opportunities. Now that we all work remote, that's a little different. But, back in the day, when you had to be going into the office and you had to live in a certain time zone and so forth, that had both pros and cons, right? There was lifestyle pros and cons. There was cost of living pros and cons, but there was also volume of opportunity pros and cons. The second piece was salary, right? We all would love to make as much money as possible. Money doesn't solve all problems, but it does solve certain problems. It's nice to have more than less when certain things happen. But salary was one of those things that always came into play. Was it enough to meet your basic needs? What was the compensation sort of made up of? Was it how much of it was salary? How much of it is sort of variable compensation, whether it's like bonuses or quota or something like equity, stock options or RSUs or things like that. So that always was a factor, right? It was, kind of how much was the salary, how much it was variable, how much it was sort of guaranteed. The third thing was, what was the opportunity? What are you potentially moving to do? Are you doing this as a lateral move because you just don't necessarily like the company you're at? Maybe you're moving from the third or fourth place company in your industry to the second or first place company. Okay, cool. Like, that's great. Winning is always fun. Are you doing it because this is an opportunity for you to take on more responsibility, to move into a section of the industry that's really exciting to you, right? So opportunity was always the hardest one to quantify because all opportunities in tech always sort of sound great on the surface and, oh, we're going to change the world and all these sort of things. But you had to sort of be realistic about it. And this was something that I know Aaron and I have done quite a bit, is sort of try and do some scenario planning of these quote unquote opportunities, right? Like, okay, once you unwrap the box and you take the ribbon off and you kind of rub the shine off whatever the opportunity was, now what happens, right? Like, what's the worst case scenario that can happen? What's the best case scenario? What are 2 or 3 realistic scenarios that could happen? Because the worst thing you can have is, and I've had this happen at a couple of jobs, I hate to say it, within 2 days, 5 days, a week and a half, 2 weeks, you're like, what did I get myself into? And you don't want that to happen. So this is where this is where it's good to have some friends in the industry, some people that have been through some things as mentors and guides to help you with some opportunity stuff. Because the last thing you want to do is walk away from a job that you're like, I like 90% of it. It's fine. It's good. That 10% is just rubbing you raw. It just drives you crazy. And then to walk into a job where 75% of it drives you crazy and you're like, oh, I can't believe I left that other job. Right. In some cases, maybe not as much earlier in your career, where you're really trying to find experience, and see things and experience new things and put some things on your resume and so forth. But at some point, title matters, right? And so I've seen people who have taken jobs for title. Look, I want to move from being a manager level to a director level. I want to move from being a director level to, senior director or vice president. And, early in my career, and I've heard various things about this, but the guidance we typically would hear from people is like, don't chase titles for the sake of chasing titles. I'll be honest with you, as you get a little further into your career, into your late 30s and 40s and so forth, like, chasing titles isn't necessarily a terrible thing to do. It's, again, check the previous boxes first, make sure it's things you like, things you can be successful with, people that you want to work with and so forth. But, very honestly with you, at some point, if you become, if you go from sort of manager to director or director to vice president, the things that then come to you as opportunities from recruiters and others tend to be at that level. People tend to go, well, somebody else has trusted you at that level. We can probably trust you at that level. And so, if you're changing jobs for title, again, think through that, but there's times and places where that's the right thing. And then obviously, job risk, right? What are the odds that the job pans out the way it is? What are the odds that the person who's going to be your next manager is going to be around for a while, right? So as excited as you might be getting about the opportunity, figure out like, okay, who am I going to work for? What's their ambition? What do they think their next steps are? How long do they think they're going to be in this job? How long do you think they're going to be in this job? Because again, just like you don't want to go to a job and know that you're going to hate it after 2 weeks, you also don't want to go in and have your boss not be there after a month or 6 months or something. Because, and trust me, I've been in those jobs before too. If all of a sudden you're working for somebody who didn't hire you, or they're not even sure why all of a sudden you're on their team, that's another bad place to be. And you've sort of lost all equity with the process that got you into the door. So those are all things to sort of keep in mind once you potentially get to a point where you think about, should I change jobs? Right? Should I consider going somewhere else? Should I consider going to a different company or moving for the job or whatever? Okay. So that's sort of the second thing is, as you're considering all that stuff, you kind of want to make a scorecard of it, right? Which one of these things is the most important to me? And they're going to be different for different people. In some cases, you're going to say, money is the most important thing. I'm willing to travel. I'm willing to work 70 or 80 hours a week. I don't really care where I'm going to be. I need for the next 2 years to make as much money as possible. That's fine, right? Other cases, it's going to be, it needs to be in these areas because maybe we've got 2 kids and we need family nearby to help us take care of the kids because my job is taxing, or me and my wife or me and my spouse, we both work and we need help with certain things, or we just love the local sports team and we love, we get so much joy out of going to those games on the weekend. And if we're not going to be able to go to those things, gosh, I can't imagine what my life would be like without those things. So, take all of it into consideration, figure out which things are the most important, which things are the second most important, kind of weigh them accordingly, do some scenario planning and sort of think through like, okay, let's suppose I did move across the country to location X. What would that mean? Right. And anyways, so lots of stuff there. We probably could do a whole set of shows on that. Maybe Aaron and I will do a set of shows on just that kind of discussion. Now, the last part about this, and gosh, I've been going for a long, long time. The part about the manager versus technical. This is a really hard question because I think what you're going to find over time is, and this is the thing I guess you got to figure out is what does the path in one versus the other look like? Because at some point, and this is just sort of my experience, the younger you are, the more you're doing pure technology, is really fun early on, right? Like you think I'm just learning stuff. People just think I'm great because I'm able to do something, build something, whatever that thing might be. And you get a lot of kudos for it and so forth. At some point, you're going to start to realize in your career that the line sort of blurs naturally. So for example, if you were, you started off as an engineer and then you became like kind of a senior engineer and you sort of moved up the ranks, let's say at some point you're the CTO, you're on the sort of technical side of the spectrum, for example, you're going to spend less of your time doing hands-on no matter what, right? So if you become the CTO, as much as it sounds like, oh, I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm the smartest person in the company, as our friend Rodrigo Flores has said many times, who's been a CTO as well as a CEO, at some point you become the chief talking officer as opposed to the chief technology officer, right? You're having to explain technology. You're having to do a lot of, talking about it and less hands-on with it. And at the same time, with being on the people side of things, early on, you may feel like, well, I'm doing mostly, kind of lower level manager stuff. And maybe I don't always feel like I necessarily have control of things because I only have a certain number of resources available to me. There's only so much I can get done. I'm pretty good at it. Maybe I'm good at, planning or scheduling or being organized or, getting stuff done on time. As you grow in that type of role, you end up taking on more strategy. So you're less responsible for, individual teams and day-to-day tasks and, sort of small KPI, OKRs and KPIs and things like that. And you get more into sort of strategy. You're expected to be a bigger thinker. You're expected to, understand more of the business. You're expected to understand, the intersection between technology and business, right? So it's funny that the further you sort of go up the rungs in the ladder on either end of the spectrum, you actually are being asked to cross over one way or the other, right? The more you're on the business side, you're also expected to understand the ramifications of the technology. The more you're on the technology side, you're expected to understand the ramifications of communications and business and all those sort of things. And so, I think the answer to a certain extent is going to be, you want to find where you're passionate and you want to find where you enjoy stuff. You also need to understand that at some point the things will sort of blur. There won't be sort of distinction. And you sort of have to ask yourself, like, what are some of the bigger goals I want to get, right? Can I push through this period of time when I'm, on the second rung of the ladder or the third rung of the ladder and get to where I want to, get to some higher level. So look at the people in your organization higher up and go, maybe I could aspire to be that person. Like that seems like a role I'd really enjoy. And if you look at, kind of both sides of the spectrum in where you are and you go, gosh, this just doesn't really work for me, right? Like, let's say you're doing consulting and you say, boy, this doesn't really work for me because I would like to have more stability. For example, like I hate bouncing from one to the other or something. Or maybe you're in some role where it's technology and you're like, it's just not moving fast enough. Well, maybe you're like, well, maybe I should go work for one of the vendors or work for one of, a systems integrator where we're exposed to lots of different technologies. I think you have to sort of look at both, what would you like to be looking at? And we always tell people, like, don't necessarily look at your next job, look at what your next job is going to allow you to do. What options does it open up for you in that second job from where you're looking, right? So if I take this next job, what paths does that allow for me in the follow-up job, right? Does that give me 2 paths? Does that give me 3 paths? Does it give me 6 potential options? Think about that sort of stuff, right? If you're only thinking about the next job, especially when you're earlier in your career, you're probably a little bit too short-sighted. So again, I'm 30 something minutes into this. I haven't given a definitive answer because there isn't really a definitive answer. I think the best thing you can do is hopefully try and paint yourself a little bigger picture of where you're at. Figure out, how much of what frustrates you is temporary versus long-term. Figure out, what you can do to be the best at the things that maximize your skills that are the best. And there's nothing wrong with if you don't love the environment that you're in. So let's say in this case, the consulting part of it, where might those same skill sets be valuable to somebody else or may bring you more happiness given the skill sets in the mix that you have. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up there because I've gone for a long time. I know I didn't give a definitive answer. I hope I gave some decent frameworks as far as how to think about some of these things. Again, this industry has so many different kinds of jobs, and sometimes they're very technical, sometimes they're very people-centric, but for the most part, they end up being some blend of the two of them. And I think the nice thing about our industry is that because we have so much technology that happens, it's so complicated, people have such ambitions for what it's possibly can do, that there are almost endless combinations of what you can potentially be involved with. And you really just have to figure out, what skills do I want to emphasize? What skills can I make really good? And then, maybe where do I find the best fit? And this is where, sometimes you got to ask around. Sometimes you just got to pick people out in your industry and be like, well, what do you do? What does your week look like? What does your year look like? And then maybe figure out, well, I might like to do that. Like that might be interesting. So, apologize to the questioner for not giving a definitive answer. I don't think even if I had done this in an email, I could have given you this is the specific thing to do. But hopefully for anybody who's kind of going through these crossroads, which you'll likely go through multiple times in your career, it gives you some stuff to think about, some frameworks to use, some trade-offs to use, some ways to think about the scoring, some ways to think about, what's important versus, what's controllable versus uncontrollable. I think you got to think about all those sort of things. And it's hard because sometimes our emotions or our frustrations or our anxieties get in the way and they become really strong at any given point in time. But yeah, if you can kind of have some frameworks in your mind, I think it helps. I think it helps to have some people around you, industry colleagues, friends, that you can just bounce things off of, off the record, man. Hey, I'm thinking about doing this, or I'm thinking about doing that. What do you think? And just having some people that will be honest with you, both about what they think about a situation, but also honest with you about, will your skills fit that? Does your ambition fit that? Does do you really understand what these trade-offs mean to you? Maybe you're kind of blind to certain things. So anyways, hope that helps. Kind of a long Sunday perspective, but I feel like this is one of these topics that deserves, a decent amount of discussion. Probably ought to be something we do as a series, because I think, both job choice, but sort of longer term career planning, is a useful topic. Learning when to pivot, when not to pivot, how to deal with things that are unexpected, probably is a whole series of show we should do. So I'll jot that down as something Aaron and I should talk about, because if you've listened to the show for a while, Aaron and I have had no shortage of having bounced around for roles for good reasons and bad reasons and other things. So anyways, thank you for the question. As always, thank you to everybody who sends us questions and comments and feedback and so forth. Hopefully this is useful. Hopefully some part of it was useful if it's relevant to you. Anyways, thanks for listening. We'll listen to you. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for helping us, get feedback. 5 stars on Apple or Google or Spotify is always appreciated. It helps us grow the community. And with that, I'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.